Okay, welcome back to Chapter 15, Part 3. So, in this section, we are going to talk about mood disorders. Obviously, you probably all know the most common mood disorder, which would be depression. So, we'll talk a little bit about that one. We're also going to talk about anxiety disorders. So, things like generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder, and pretty much all of those other phobias and things that involve extreme feelings of anxiety. So in this section, we're discussing basically what are the most common types of mental disorders that people tend to experience. And again, as I mentioned in the last slideshow, I'm not really going to focus much on their causes. I'm going to focus more on the defining kind of symptoms and characteristics of each. So, anxiety disorders. An anxiety disorder is categorized, it basically refers to a category of disorders involving fear or nervousness that is excessive, irrational, and maladaptive. They're among the most frequently diagnosed type of disorders, so approximately 1 in 8 Canadians suffers from some form of anxiety disorder. Obviously, everyone experiences anxiety or worry at times. Those occasional experiences of anxiety are normal, but what separates anxiety disorders from normal experience is the intensity and the duration of the response, as well as its relevance to one's current circumstances. So basically, we're looking for anxiety that is disproportional to the situation. So you're getting a lot more anxious than you should be given the circumstances. It may become detached from the situation, so you feel anxious even in the absence of any real reason to feel anxious, and it is prolonged in its intensity, so it persists far longer than it should. So even after a stressful situation has passed, you're still experiencing those feelings of anxiety. So when the anxiety is disproportional, detached, and prolonged, it's considered to be disordered. Psychologists have identified distinct patterns of experience that have given rise to several major types of anxiety disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and phobias. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those. The first type of anxiety disorder we'll discuss is known as generalized anxiety disorder, which is a disorder involving frequently elevated levels of anxiety, generally from normal changes and stresses of everyday life. So the people who suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, they're feeling stress because of the same types of things that everyone tends to be stressed over, but they may be experiencing, stress that is, or anxiety that is disproportional to the situation, so far more anxiety than they should be, or it's persisting and is prolonged kind of long after any threat has passed. So a person with generalized anxiety disorder fears disaster lurking around every corner. They're constantly on edge, constantly on kind of high alert, and waiting for something bad to happen. Obviously, as a result of this, people with generalized anxiety disorder may have trouble sleeping, breathing, or concentrating. However, as the anxiety arises out of ongoing situations and circumstances, so things that are actually kind of being experienced in their life, people with generalized anxiety disorder typically have a hard time understanding their experience and identifying specific reasons for why they are so anxious. So they have a really hard time coping with the fact that they are far more anxious than they need to be, and sometimes it's hard for them to identify a specific source for their anxiety. This in turn makes their anxiety very difficult to resolve, as the anxiety constantly switches its source as each issue is dealt with. So once they deal with one stressor or one threat, perceived threat, then the anxiety switches to a different source. So it's kind of constantly in motion, and they're never really able to escape that kind of overarching level of anxiety. So people with generalized anxiety disorder typically have unstable, irritable moods, and they experience many difficulties in their day-to-day functioning. So as we mentioned, they have trouble sleeping a lot of the time. They may have trouble concentrating and not really be able to kind of focus on things at work or in school. So it's going to impact their life negatively in a lot of different ways. Next, we have panic disorder, which is an anxiety disorder marked by occasional episodes of sudden, very intense fear. It's distinct from generalized anxiety disorder because anxiety occurs in short segments, but can be much more severe. So somebody who has GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, they are in kind of a constant state of apprehension, but it's not, super, super intense. a lot of the time. It's just they constantly feel like something is wrong or something bad is going to happen. People with panic disorder, they have short bursts of very severe anxiety that can be far more severe than what's experienced on a day-to-day basis for someone with GAD. So the key feature of panic disorder is what we call panic attacks, which you've probably all heard of and many of you have probably experienced at some point. Brief moments of extreme anxiety that include a rush of physical activity paired with frightening thoughts. So a substantial subset of people with panic disorder develop a recurring fear that the panic will strike again. So basically what happens is they have that panic attack, they have that panic reaction, and it makes them feel really bad. They tend to get, a rush of physiological arousal, and their heart is racing, and they're sweating, and they just feel really not well. And then they, in turn, develop a fear of having that panic reaction occurring again. Particularly, they're fearful of having it occur in an environment where they'd be exposed and unable to escape. So this fear can result in what we call agoraphobia. You've probably heard of agoraphobia. It's often misrepresented in the media as somebody who just doesn't like leaving their house. But basically what it is a fear of fear. It's a fear of having that fear reaction or that panic attack in public. And as a result of this fear, the individual may begin to avoid public settings and increasingly isolate him or herself. So in extreme cases, this can lead to people refusing to leave their home. So a lot of the time you may hear of agoraphobia, somebody who just doesn't go out and they're kind of like keep to themselves. But really what it is they're trying to limit their exposure to places where they might be exposed and unable to escape should that panic reaction occur. So they're essentially afraid of having that fear reaction. And their safe place is typically their home, so that's why they kind of stay there. They know they won't be exposed there if they were to have that panicked reaction. Then we have phobias. So a phobia is a severe, irrational fear of a very specific object or situation. They're often divided into two broad categories, specific phobias and social phobias. So we'll talk briefly about some specific phobias here, and then we'll talk a bit about social anxiety. So a specific phobia involves an intense fear of a specific object, activity, or an organism. So for example, a fear of a specific animal, such as a snake or a spider, fear of heights, fear of thunder, fear of blood or injections, all of those would be considered examples of specific phobias. And so table 15.3, which I've included here, kind of gives some examples of more common phobias. So 50% of people have at one point in time experienced a phobia of some type of animal. 62% have experienced a phobia of some kind of natural environmental factors such as height, storms, water. 42% blood or bodily injury. 55% situations, so going to the dentist, going to the hospital, being in a crowded place, having that kind of maybe claustrophobic reaction. So you see that over 50% have experienced most of these phobias at one time or another. And then currently experiencing phobia, the highest rate we see here is for natural environments, so heights, storms, water. Heights is a very, very common one, and it does make sense because as we talked about in the learning chapter, we are biologically predisposed to fear things that could actually hurt us, such as heights or animals. So it does make sense that those types of phobias are some of the most common types of phobias. Then we have social anxiety disorder, which basically, in contrast to a specific phobia, it's not really a fear of a specific object or specific situation. It's a very strong fear of being judged by others or being embarrassed or humiliated in public. So people with social anxiety disorder, they tend to try to develop familiar routines that can quickly kind of get them in and out of situations where they might be exposed to social interactions. And they also always make sure to kind of have an exit strategy or an exit plan for when they go out in public. So social anxiety, unfortunately, generally leads people to limit their social activities, which makes it very difficult for them to lead a normal life. So in order to cope with that fear, to deal with that fear, they tend to avoid social situations, which of course, as we know, only reinforces the fear, reinforces that avoidance behavior. So they avoid the situation, they feel better, and so therefore they continue to avoid the situation. As you may have noticed in talking about these anxiety disorders tend to be self-perpetuating, meaning that they basically kind of keep themselves going over time. So anxiety tends to lead to circumstances that provoke further anxiety, and it's kind of like a vicious cycle. So avoiding or interrupting this cycle is central to the treatment of anxiety disorders. Instead of trying to minimize contact with the feared situation, which obviously is what most people try to do, and that unfortunately reinforces the fear, we must practice confronting the fear head on. So the only way to really cure somebody of a severe phobia is through what we call exposure therapy. So the most important part of psychological therapy for anxiety in general is exposure. The person is repeatedly and in stages exposed to the object of their fear so that they can work past their emotional reactions. So it's only through exposing them to that feared situation or feared stimulus that you're going to be able to kind of reverse that fear reaction. It's based on the principles of counter conditioning, which we talked about way back in chapter 6 last semester. So for exposure to work, it should be coupled with helping people to calm themselves down. So at each stage, when you're being introduced to a feared stimulus or a feared situation, you should be practicing relaxation techniques and trying to kind of calm that autonomic nervous system arousal that's occurring, and learning to tolerate aversive feelings as they arise. So kind of note the fact that you are having these aversive reactions, but being able to tolerate them and kind of work through them. And over time, the more you're exposed to that feared stimulus or situation without the fear reaction, the more that reinforces and kind of eliminates and kind of causes that fear reaction to go extinct. So that's really the only way, through exposure is really the only way that we can help really eliminate a lot of these anxiety disorders, specifically phobias. So now we'll talk very briefly about obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, unfortunately, I just don't have the time to give all of these conditions the attention that they deserve. I'd love to talk all day about the different kind of causes and symptoms and things like that, but we just don't have time in the semester. I am halfway through the slideshow and it's looking good. We're only at about 12 minutes so far. So I think what I'm going to do is let you guys know that basically these first 3 modules will be our content for Monday and Wednesday, and then on Friday we'll cover the content on schizophrenia. So we're making good progress in terms of time. But I will kind of continue being brief in my description just because I don't want you to have 1,000,001 things to remember for your final, especially because now it's going to be online and that makes everything a little trickier. So until 2013, obsessive compulsive disorder was categorized as an anxiety disorder in the DSM. So it was kind of within the spectrum of anxiety disorders, but now it has been placed in its own category. It's a little bit different than some of the other anxiety disorders that we've talked about so far. So OCD is a disorder characterized by unwanted, inappropriate, and persistent thoughts, which are known as obsessions, and repetitive, often quite ritualistic behaviors, which are known as compulsions. So generally, the compulsive behavior serves as a means of coping with the anxiety caused by the obsession. So for example, if somebody is experiencing a really severe obsession around being contaminated or being dirty, having kind of germs on them, those types of things, then that would be considered their obsessive part, that they're kind of constantly thinking about germs and thinking about being contaminated. And the compulsion that would go along with that would be constantly cleaning or washing their hands, things like that. So often you see that the obsessions are linked with the compulsion, and the compulsion is a behavior that's performed in order to try to help reduce the severity of the obsession. So you can see here in table 15.4 on the side, there's a lot of people. They did a survey of 293 individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder, and they found some of the most common obsessions and some of the most common compulsions. So obsessions being contaminated, persistent doubting of themselves, also, doubting that maybe they've locked their door, or that they've done things correctly, needing to arrange things in symmetrical patterns. We've only got about 48%. A lot of people kind of have this stereotype of OCD in their head as everyone needs to kind of arrange things symmetrically. That's not always the case. The fear of being contaminated and doubting yourself and kind of having to check things and clean things, that tends to be more popular in terms of symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder. And a lot of the compulsions we see include checking, so having to check that the door is locked 5 times before you leave the house, cleaning, which again is often associated with that obsession about being contaminated or being unclean, and then repeating actions is another one that's very frequent in terms of a compulsion that's exhibited by a lot of people with OCD. I put in this slide on post-traumatic stress disorder. Your textbook mentioned it very briefly in Module 1 when they were talking about something unrelated, but it didn't actually mention it again in the anxiety disorder section. So I just wanted to add in one slide from the old textbook about it. So obviously, in the aftermath of any crisis, war, rape, torture, natural disaster, stress symptoms such as insomnia, agitation, and jumpiness are completely normal. But if these symptoms persist for a month or longer and begin to impair overall functioning, that's when they may be labeled as post-traumatic stress disorder. So typical symptoms of PTSD involve reliving the trauma in recurrent and intrusive thoughts, a sense of detachment from others, increased physiological arousal, so that might lead to insomnia, impaired concentration, so they might have kind of increased heart rate, respiration, things like that, and loss of interest in familiar activities. So you can see that some of these symptoms are kind of indicative of depression as well, which we'll talk about shortly. And so I just wanted to kind of mention PTSD here because I know it is a very common disorder and it's one that a lot of people have questions about. So this would be kind of the technical definition and some of the symptoms if you're talking about PTSD. And I'm not really going to kind of touch on that last point there, but there has definitely been some physical symptoms associated with PTSD as well. Or I guess I should say biological factors. Sorry, my computer flipped to the next slide automatically and I kind of lost my train of thought. So now we're going to talk about mood disorders. Mood disorders are very common. They affect almost 10% of adults in Canada and the US, so 1 in 10 people will experience a mood disorder or is experiencing mood disorder typically. Due to a combination of biopsychosocial factors, rates of depression are twice as high among women as among men, and they're 3 times as high among people living in poverty as those who are not. And there's also a genetic susceptibility for mood disorders as well. So we have seen a lot of genetic factors linked with the onset and prevalence of things like depression, and sometimes even bipolar disorder. We obviously all feel sadness at times in our lives, but in comparison, major depression can be very severe and can occur even in the absence of events or circumstances that we would normally associate it with a depressed mood. So that's kind of the key thing there, is that it's not just about feeling sad, it's about having an overwhelming feeling of sadness that persists for quite a long period of time. So if you actually look at, say, the DSM criteria for major depression, you're going to see that they have to fit, I believe it's like 8 out of 13 of kind of these major symptoms associated with depression, but it also has to persist for at least a 2-week period to be classified as a major depressive episode. So major depression is a disorder marked by prolonged periods of sadness, feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, social withdrawal, and cognitive and physical sluggishness. It is so much more than just a prolonged bad mood. So you really have to kind of look at all the different types of factors that are taken into account by the definition of major depression. It's not just about a subjective feeling of sadness, it's also about a loss of interest in daily activities, things that you typically enjoy. It might lead to people neglecting kind of hygiene and sleep and eating. Sometimes people will eat more than usual, sometimes less. Sometimes people will sleep more than usual, sometimes less. But it's basically just kind of alterations and disruptions from the norm in terms of your psychological and physical functioning. So to fully understand depression requires considering the full impact of life's activities being interfered with by feelings of despair, uselessness, and a lack of energy and motivation. So there's a lot of factors that we need to take into account to kind of fully understand just how severely depression can impact somebody. In contrast, bipolar disorder, which is formerly known as manic depression, is characterized by extreme highs and lows in mood, motivation, and energy. So it involves depression at one end and mania, which is an extremely energized positive mood, at the other end. So mania can involve talking fast, racing thoughts, impulsive and spontaneous decisions, and or engaging in high-risk behavior. So with mania, it's kind of seen as like the highest high, and depression will be kind of the lowest low, but in reality, both of them can be almost equally dangerous, if not mania at times can be more dangerous, because once you've reached that highest high, you may have engaged in a lot of risky behaviors without thinking of the consequences, and that'll make your next low even lower. So mania can be very dangerous in terms of people engaging in risky behavior and, spending a lot of money, maybe gambling, acting impulsively. So it can be just as detrimental, if not more so sometimes, than the depressive episodes. In terms of the cognitive aspects of depression, depressed people tend to develop a pessimistic explanatory style when something bad happens. They tend to make internal personal attributions. So we talked a bit about pessimistic explanatory style in the last chapter on coping and health, and Sorry, I was interrupted momentarily by a very excited wiener dog who wanted to see his mom. So coming back to the cognitive aspects of depression, depressed people tend to develop a pessimistic explanatory style. So when something bad happens, they tend to make internal personal attributions. And so we talked about the pessimistic explanatory style in the last chapter on coping. And what we talked about there was basically that they tend to blame the bad things that happen on them as a person. So they make these internal personal attributions about the negative things. It's my fault. It's because I'm not good enough. And they also tend to make stable attributions, which basically means they assume the situation is going to persist. So saying something like, it's my fault, it's because of who I am, and it's never going to get better, that would be considered a stable attribution. Finally, as they spiral into catastrophic ways of thinking, they tend to make global attributions as well, which is expanding the impact of the negative event into their overall life. So just because this one bad thing happened, now it means that everything's going to be bad, and everything's always going to be bad, and it's because of who I am as a person. So you can see how that personal, stable, and global kind of way of attributing things, making it seem like it's based on you as a person and something that's going to persist always and affect all areas of your life, can really contribute to kind of that negative downward spiral that's kind of indicative of people who are experiencing severe depression. There are also genetic risk factors related to depression. Your textbook actually talks quite a bit about them, but I'm not going into it here. But there is something called the diathesis stress model, sorry, I always mess that one up, which illustrates the interaction between a genetic predisposition for disorder and life stressors. So basically what that means is for any individual case of depression or anxiety or any other disorder, we want to be looking at both the genetic predispositions that somebody experiences or kind of has, and then also the stressful events that are occurring. It's also known sometimes as a vulnerability stress model. So a person's individual vulnerabilities interact with their stressful events in life to basically determine whether or not somebody's going to develop a type of mental disorder. So just looking kind of in a picture form at the cognitive aspects of depression, you see we've got internalizing. So I'm so stupid, it's my fault, I'm a bad person. Stabilizing, it's always going to be this way, things will never change, they will never get better. And then globalizing, and this applies to everything, not just my current situation. So you can see how having that kind of depressive explanatory style can really contribute to the cyclic nature of depression. Finally, I just wanted to talk about suicide very briefly. Just fair warning that, if it's something that you've been affected by and you don't want to listen to this part, you don't have to. I typically don't put questions about suicide on the test for that reason, but I do think it's important to talk about, so I'm going to briefly cover it here. For people who have not experienced a mood disorder, it's very difficult to imagine how someone could reach such a low point that they would consider suicide. Nonetheless, suicide remains a serious public health concern. It is the second leading cause of death among Canadian youth. So it's only basically topped by motor vehicle accidents. So the second leading cause of death among Canadian youth is dying by suicide. There is a variation in who is most likely to die by suicide, and I should point out at this point, just because I believe in kind of educating people and learning from things like this, and something that I learned in the past year is we no longer say commit suicide, we say die by suicide, because commit has that kind of negative connotation to it. It sounds like a crime. So there's a variation in who is most likely to die by suicide. It's 4 times more likely among males than among females. Females attempt probably at similar rates, but they tend to be less successful. They use less lethal means typically. And the highest rates are in elderly populations. So a lot of people would think that younger people are more likely to die by suicide, but we actually see that the rates of suicide among people aged 65 up is 60% higher than the rate for teens. So in many cases, there are clear warning signs evident That's not to say that there always will be, but it is important to understand the risk factors, which include having a mood disorder, having recently gone through extremely stressful life events, having easy access to lethal means, and having substance abuse kind of in combination with any of these other factors, and also to know what signs to look for. So it's very important to kind of recognize the signs of suicide so that if somebody you love or even yourself are having these types of thoughts, then you're able to kind of get the help that you need for yourself or for others. So table 15.5 in your textbook has a list of warning signs for suicide. Well, they say committing right here, which again, we don't typically say. Talks about dying by suicide, we should probably say. And a lot of people think that you shouldn't ask somebody who is potentially suicidal if they are considering suicide, because that might put the idea in their mind. That's a complete and utter myth. It is actually one of the recommended things to do if you think that somebody might be contemplating suicide, is to ask them outright, are you thinking of suicide? That's, in my training as a crisis counselor, that's literally what we're told to do. We have to ask very directly if it's something they're considering, because if it is something they're seriously contemplating, chances are they will tell you. And if it's not something they're contemplating, you are not going to put them at risk of suicide just by mentioning it. I promise. So people who talk about dying by suicide, who have trouble eating or sleeping, who exhibit drastic changes in behavior, withdraw from friends or social activities. So a lot of these are kind of characteristic of depression or other mental disorder as well. One of the major ones to highlight here is gives away prized possessions. That's something that is kind of a really strong indication that somebody might be contemplating suicide, because often when people are kind of in that last stage before attempting suicide, they tend to try to kind of, they're set, their mind is made up, and they start to kind of give away the things that they love to other people because they know they'll have no longer use for them. People who have attempted suicide before are at a much higher risk. And honestly, I don't see it on this list, but one other thing is if somebody who you know has been having a rough time and has been exhibiting symptoms of depression and things like that, if they suddenly seem to have kind of gotten a lot better, that's actually a warning sign for suicide as well. So a lot of the time people think, oh, that person made some kind of miraculous recovery, but a lot of the time people who have been struggling with thoughts of suicide and have finally made a decision to die by suicide, they feel a great sense of relief having made their mind up. And so a lot of the time it will come across as them having kind of gotten a lot better or feeling a lot better. So that's actually another warning sign to look for. So I put in some resources here. 3 of these are from your textbook. The 4th one, the reasontolive.ca, that's actually a Manitoba resource created by Clinic Community Health, which is who I was volunteering with as a crisis counselor. So if you or someone you know may be at risk of suicide, here are some helpful resources for you. We've got Kids Help Phone. There's 3 websites here. If you click on them or control and click on them or right click on them, you should be able to follow the links. And I double check to make sure they're all working for you. So definitely kind of keep those resources in mind, because honestly, they could save a life. So that is it for Module 3. So again, only at 28 minutes, so altogether, basically we're at about an hour and a half for these 2 modules. We had 23 for the first one, just over 30 for the last one, and just under 30 for this one. So that will be your content for Monday, March 23rd, and Wednesday, March 25th for your classes. And then I will work at getting the 4th module on schizophrenia completed and up by tomorrow evening, which will be Monday evening, so you'll have that with plenty of time to spare for Friday. If you have any questions, please let me know. As of right now, our final will be online, so you're going to have to basically write it in the same way you would write your Moodle quizzes. We're just going to have more questions and the same amount of time, because it is going to be a test rather than just kind of an easy quiz. But I will keep you posted on that as we are kind of giving updates ourselves. This has been a very interesting and unique experience, kind of dealing with this pandemic and switching all of our stuff to online. So hopefully you're able to listen to these lectures and learn some stuff and enjoy. But if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and let me know. And I will talk to you later.